Welcome to the Theoretical Neuroscience Podcast. I am the host, Gaute Einvoll. Most of us are amazed by the performances of present-day AI when it comes to, for example, image recognition, voice and text translation, or text generation with the latest large language models. This AI is based on large networks of simplified neuron-like units that are trained with large amounts of data combined with the backpropagation of errors or other learning rules. In so-called supervised learning, where the training data is labeled so that one can check whether the network makes the correct prediction or not, this backpropagation learning rule propagates the measured error backwards and gives a prescription for how to modify the connection weights across the network. Technically, this learning rule depends on differentiation of the so-called neuronal activation functions, which converts inputs to the neurons into outputs from the neurons. This works fine for the type of continuous model neurons used in present-day AI. That is, neurons where both input and outputs are real numbers and smoothly varying in time. However, the outputs of neurons in the brain are typically not smoothly varying. They are spikes, that is, sharp action potentials, and the neuronal activation functions are not differentiable. Thus, if we want to train networks made of spiking neuron models, like integrated fire-type neurons, we cannot use the standard backpropagation learning rule. We need something else. The search for new learning rules for supervised training of spiking neural networks has been an active research field, and today's guest, Friedemann Zenke, has made important contributions to it. In 2018, Friedemann, now a professor at University of Basel in Switzerland, published a new learning rule called SuperSpike, developed by him and Surya Ganguly. In the first part of the podcast, we talk about the challenges of making a learning rule for spiking networks and go through the different elements of the particular SuperSpike learning rule. But supervised learning doesn't seem to be the way that real brains learn, at least not the only way. For one, there are no good candidate explanations for how something like the backpropagation learning rule could be implemented with known biophysical mechanisms in the brain. Also, it is clear that we humans can learn even when we don't have a teacher that supervises us and tells us whether our present predictions are correct or not. In a recent paper, Friedemann, together with his PhD student Manu Halvagal, suggest a biologically more plausible alternative, namely an algorithm based on self-supervised learning, which can be used both for networks with continuous neuronal units and for spiking neural networks. Self-supervised learning is a type of unsupervised learning which does not rely on labeled data as used in supervised learning, but rather on other principles, for example, predictions of what happens next. In the second part of the podcast, Friedemann goes through the new self-supervised learning rule and discusses its use. As for all episode information and relevant links can be found at the webpage theoreticalneuroscience.no. And if you want to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/theoreticalneurosciencepodcast and choose a membership of your liking. For example, at the cost of $1 per month. As a member, you will get access to a video version of the podcast recordings, as well as episode transcripts. And note that there is a 7-day free trial period when you sign up. I also have a YouTube channel called Theoretical Neuroscience Podcast, where you can watch the videos as well. I will be most grateful if you become a Patreon supporter to help me fund the production of the podcast, even if you're not too interested in looking at the videos. But I also appreciate all the other listeners, and I hope that all of you can help spread the word about the podcast to other people in the community, on social media or otherwise. Okay, here is Friedemann. So, welcome to the podcast, Friedemann.
Thank you very much. It's very exciting to be here.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah. So, I mean, this podcast is really about sort of how to learn by modifying synaptic weights, right? And that, I guess, that really has been your research. I think for me, you're still a young man, but I guess you've been around for a few years. But that has been sort of your research topic, right? mainly.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, that is
Yeah.
still my fascination, and we still haven't solved it yet.
No, and it's obviously, I mean, because I have never worked on it really, but I'm sort of, this is sort of like at the, I think the key to many things, if we're able to understand how it's done and implement it, this like synaptic plasticity rules efficiently. And and I guess you, like many of the people who have sort of like, I know that is doing are doing excellent work on this. Are they like where you are one of the example? Are examples is coming from the group of Wolfram Gerstner. So he's the he's the, I guess he's the sort of like the scientific father of many of these. You also worked with him, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I did my PhD with Wolfram, and it's true. A lot of people from his group pursue academic careers and work on plasticity.
Yeah, at least in Europe, I know sort of. That's probably quite sure there are good work being done by people who have not learned from Wolfram directly. So anyway, so I mean, there's like we got in this podcast, it's like two topics, both sort of like how to improve sort of like essentially AI learning rules, and also how to sort of to try to understand how are these what are called AI learning rules, and then there's a BI learning rules, biological intelligence learning rules, right? So we first start with this like your paper, I think from 2018 or something, with a called a SuperSpike, where you develop this sort of learning rule for spiking neural networks with an AI application. But I think maybe we should just start with like an introduction, sort of how do, I mean, how do the standard, how do rate models learn? I mean, what? Yeah. So how do rate models learn? How are sort of the, what's the standard way of training a neural network, especially with AI application and then convolutional neural nets and so on?
Right. Well, I think it's been now basically a decade, right, that deep learning has really been around to stay. And I think there, really, the workhorse that made these networks perform was the availability of an efficient learning algorithm that is usually backpropagation, so it's gradient based learning,
Mhm.
which tries to correct errors at the output. So the keyword is really end to end learning. So you
Yeah,
define
so
the loss
that's, yeah.
function.
So what is meant by end-to-end learning? So that you sort of check the result at the output layer of the network.
Exactly,
Yeah,
genau.
yeah.
So the computation is done by the entire network, and you need to fiddle with synapses that are often neither directly connected to the input nor directly connected to the output, but somewhere
Mm.
in the middle of the network.
Yeah.
And so, how does this synapse know what it should do, whether it should go up or down, and in order to improve
Mm.
the accuracy, for instance, of a network on a specific task? And this is what's commonly also called the credit assignment problem. So,
Mm.
who is to credit or blame for an error that has occurred at the output?
Mm.
And these gradient-based algorithms, they try to minimize these errors by computing gradients
Mm.
and then following the negative
Mm.
gradient. Yeah.
So this is also an example that's like supervised learning, right? Because that's what is meant by supervised learning.
Right. So supervised learning usually assumes that you have a defined target, a label for the output.
Mm.
Um, so to answer your question, it doesn't have to be supervised learning. You can do end-to-end learning in an unsupervised or self-supervised setting.
Mm.
But supervised learning assumes that you already know what output you want to some extent.
Mm.
And that's typically how the original deep learning work kind of emerged. But nowadays, we're seeing very different learning paradigms, which are called self-supervised learning. There, you usually also have a target, but you don't need to manually label your data. So in
Exactly.
text,
So we'll come back to that because
right.
it's, yeah. But then all this, the main application with the like the, well, the convolutional neural nets and all these language models and all this and I guess also these what's called the reinforcement learning algorithms, they are all somehow using this backprop learning rule, right?
That's right. Yeah. So most of the success really was due to the fact that you can train networks end to end, so that
Mm.
the features of the intermediate layers are learned through a learning algorithm. That's really a key of the success, as opposed to
Mm.
the symbolic approaches that we were pursuing before, where we tried to build in these feature detectors by hand.
Mm. Yeah.
And and this end to end learning really has enabled a lot just by learning the required features from a lot of data.
Mm.
And for this, as I said, we need algorithms that can, in the end, teach hidden layer neurons
Mm.
something to learn, something good. So we need to solve this credit assignment problem for that,
Mm.
and that is also the paper SuperSpike that you mentioned was an approach that we took to do this in spiking neural networks, where this where really the successes were still relatively limited at the time
Mm.
with regard to actually doing this end-to-end gradient-based learning.
And the main motivation for doing that is, I mean, I guess there's like obvious the motivation if you want to understand biological networks or actually communicate via spikes, mainly, and but also then maybe to for this like make more, especially I guess energy efficient or efficient AI applications, right? So I guess
Yes,
it's both, I guess. Mm.
these are exactly two motivations usually pursued by different camps
Mm.
in the community, the
Mm.
neuromorphic engineers versus the more computational neuroscientists. We're somehow interested in both aspects.
But that's good though. That like you're several groups working on the same problem for maybe with different motivations, because then you can sort of pull each other up, right? Maybe and learn from each other.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So, but why then is it so? Why is it so hard to learn or to train or why is it so hard for these spiking neural networks to learn?
Right. So one of the key impediments for them to learn with these aforementioned end-to-end learning algorithms was that a spike is an intrinsically very binary event, right? So it's
Mm.
either there or it's not there. We know this from neurobiology, and we even know from Hodgkin, Huxley, and colleagues. We know the theoretical principles of the mechanism of having this action potential and being this all or nothing event, and so that's really the underlying problem. And the reason why it is a problem is if you think about it, a neuron can basically make an output that's either 0 or 1, no spike, or a spike at any point in time.
Mm.
And if you now think about computing gradients and how you usually do it in a multi-layer network, for instance, using backprop, it usually amounts to computing the chain rule over and over again, right?
Mm.
So it's chain rule, chain rule, chain
So
rule.
many differentiations.
Exactly. So, but now somewhere in this big product that you get out of the chain rule is a derivative of basically a Heaviside function. So a
Mm.
threshold function that's either 0 or 1. And
Mm.
as you know, the derivative of the Heaviside function is either 0 or it's infinite. And
Mm.
if you plug this into a large product, the entire product is either 0 or infinite.
Mm.
So what you get out as a gradient is either 0, so it has a local minimum everywhere, or it's infinite. And this is obviously not a good thing to plug into
But
any
why do you say
optimization method.
Heaviside function? Because that's, I mean, it's like it's a delta function because that's the spike. It's not the same problem. It doesn't have derivatives, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
but
that's right. So technically speaking, in the continuous time, you're right. It becomes
yeah.
a direct delta function. It's often easier to visualize in discrete time, where you could think of it as a
Ah,
threshold. Yeah,
okay, exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So yeah, I guess I'm too biological. So, that's good. So this is sort of like a major principle problem, and then there's sort of this. Okay, all kinds of tricks that has been tried to deal with this, right? And is it like can they all more or less? Well, we have something called the surrogate gradient approach. So what is that?
Right. So this is the approach we took in the
Mm.
SuperSpike paper. So the idea dates back to differentiating binary neural networks, actually in machine learning. So there's work by Bengio, for instance,
Okay.
and it's commonly called there a straight-through estimator.
Okay.
So
So
it's
what's a binary neural network? That's a zero
so
one.
that's
No.
basically one with a Heaviside function as a
Okay.
nonlinearity. Yeah,
I
but no
see.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this has been a problem around, and people
Mm.
were trying to solve it for a long time. How do you use gradient-based methods where you don't have a gradient?
Mm.
And so then it was really about using a similar idea for a spiking neural network.
Mm. I see. Yeah. And then I think because you just read the introduction to this paper that there has been some attempts to develop this they have sort of like some early or some approaches where they were able to do this for a single neuron, or to make some kind of learning rule, and maybe for like a or two-layer neural network, just input and output, maybe.
Yes,
So what
even
was the history there?
right. So there were quite a few attempts over the years to get spiking neural networks to learn, and so the history was typically the approaches where you smooth your hard nonlinearity by noise. For instance, they use escape noise models, right? So if you then compute a gradient and the expectation value, you can actually compute gradients that are
Yeah,
well
so how does
defined.
that work? I mean, you have like, so then you, instead of computing spikes, you compute the probability for spiking or something?
That's exactly right. So you
Yeah.
basically need multiple trials,
Mm.
and the problem there is that it doesn't work. So this you can do up to maybe one hidden layer,
Hmm.
and then you run into the trouble that you cannot compute the chain rule efficiently for computing multiple hidden layers, because you're interested in taking an expectation value at the output of the network, but the
Mm.
expectation value in this large product does not
Mm.
compute. So it's not a product of expectation values because these terms are not independent. These are layers in a neural network.
Okay. Mm.
So the trick doesn't work anymore so nicely. So people were bound to either single neurons. So there's work
Mm.
by Jean-Pascal Pfister, Taro Toyoizumi, also from the Gerstner lab at the
Mm.
time,
Mm.
who really did this beautifully for single neurons. Jean-Pascal Pfister and Johanny Brea extended this further to now networks with one hidden layer, where already you need to use an approximation, but it works. There's work by Brian Gardner, um, uh, showing that with another approximation, they can make this work with a three-layer network, so one hidden layer. Um, but really getting to the heart of depth, right, which
Mm.
is a key enabler and making more complicated computations work and making them learnable. You need to
Meaning that you can do
backpropagate
this,
through a spike train. Yeah,
yeah, sorry, a learning rule that for many, like a deep networks with many layers.
yeah,
Yeah.
ideally, exactly.
Yeah. And you also said that, I think that when you said this new learning rule, that you, this SuperSpike learning rule, uh, and it's sort of, it's that works for that fundamentally involve spatial temporal spike pattern transformation. So I guess, so some of the problems where these earlier approaches worked were sort of not like fundamentally spatial temporal, it were more like sort of static problems, or
Yeah, so we need to differentiate a little bit. The
yeah.
ones that I just mentioned, most of them actually also looked at spatial temporal problems, but at the single neuron level. There were
Okay.
other attempts where, for instance, network translation attempts where you looked at static patterns that you encode as a rate code, for instance. And
Okay.
then so there's work by Chris Eliasmith or Chichi Lu
Mm.
from Zurich, where they looked at essentially translating a spike or rate-based classic ANN, if you
Mm.
want, into a spike-based network by doing some kind of reduction here, and then using approximations. But then you lose the time dimension as a coding dimension in this case.
Okay. Yeah.
But these approaches would work in deep networks, I should say.
Mm. Okay. So then, now, I guess one thing. Well, so you came up with this learning rule. You're coming a little bit. Well, obviously, coming back to that. That's sort of like
Yeah,
the key
yeah,
of the paper. But also, you need some way to compare. I mean, to evaluate success. So you need some kind of metric to
exactly.
compare spike trains, right? Whether your predicted spike train is the same as the target spike train.
That's exactly right. So
Yeah.
because the whole learning problem is a difficult problem, we chose that we would use supervised learning as a starting point, even though of course the principles will also apply to unsupervised loss functions. But the super and the super spike comes from supervised. Um, of course, it's also super in other ways.
Oh.
That's what we thought, but it really comes from supervised learning and spiking networks.
Oh, I didn't think
Um,
about that before now.
yeah,
I
so
think it was just like
some people just think we're pretentious.
I think it was just some youthful, joyous researchers naming. Yeah, that's fine.
That's right. So we started out with this, and then you need a metric, as you say, to
Yeah.
compare to a target spike train in this case. And we were also interested in building a learning rule that could be evaluated online, where you don't have to go backwards through time. That's one of the other main contributions of the
Mm.
work. So we also wanted a loss function that can be computed online. So we chose the Van Rossum distance, which is involves essentially filtering spike trains
Okay,
with a
so what would
kernel.
it mean? Sorry, going backwards in time. What would that mean? That would mean, yeah,
Right. So we mentioned backpropagation and
yeah,
end-to-end learning before.
mm,
So we're as soon as you have time,
mm,
we basically in the realm of recurrent neural networks, and the go-to way of training them is backpropagation through time.
yeah,
But that's obviously violating the laws of physics because
uh,
it basically reverses the time error. So if you're interested in a learning rule that can actually do this in a causal way, you need to go
yeah.
forward
Cause
through time
meaning that it can actually be done in
and online. Yeah.
exactly. Okay. Okay.
Right. But then you also need to have an error signal that's computed online. And here we really then went to the van Rossum distance, because if you choose causal kernels, like
Mm,
kernels that are shaped like an EPSP shape,
mm.
and so maybe I should explain how it works. Van
Yeah.
Rossum
Do that.
distance
Yeah.
basically convolves a spike train, a target spike train, and a reference or output spike train, convolves both of them with some kind of local kernel, and then
Mm.
subtracts them, and then you square it.
So
Then it's
some
just an
kind of
L2.
like smoothing kernel, some kind of low
That's
pass
exactly
filter.
right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you now choose some kernel that's actually causal, so it's
Uh,
not symmetric, but it's, for instance, an EPSP,
mm,
then you can compute it online. And
mm,
then in every time step, you basically get an L2 loss of the difference of these differences of these kernels.
mm.
And that's what we chose for the obvious reasons, being interested in online.
But I mean, you could have computed it online if you had just stored the previous information, right?
Yeah, to some extent, this information is now stored in this
Yeah.
temporal convolution,
Yeah,
if
I
you want.
understand. But also, you could go backwards in time, I guess, to also include sort of error. Well,
Right. You
yeah,
could go backward in time, but if you're interested in a learning rule where you think this could actually be how the brain does it,
that's
then
true.
backwards
Okay.
in time becomes a problem.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Good. So that's a Van Rossum thing. Well, Van Rossum thing. Van Rossum metric.
That's right. Yeah. So you specify a target spike train, then the network initially with random weights will generate some random output spike train. Often it's just silence actually.
Mm-hmm.
Then you compute this loss function, and then you can compute an approximate gradient on that.
And then, yeah. So then, because there are other metrics, I guess. So the key thing here is that it needed to be some kind of metric that involves some smoothing, probably,
Yes.
because there are other metrics. Isn't something called the Victor Purpura metric?
Right.
But that's maybe
Absolutely
not.
right.
That doesn't mean that. I don't really know that about. I don't remember that metric, but it's maybe not. Doesn't involve smoothing. Maybe.
So to some extent, I would say all these metrics involve some smoothing. The Victor
Mm.
Purpura is the problem; it's not local. So because times spikes can flip, so it
Okay.
becomes not locally computable in a
Okay.
single time step.
Yeah.
So it wasn't suitable for our online approach.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, then you had the Van Rossum metric, and then you came up with this gradient descent rule, right? For this in this the SuperSpike learning rule. So
Right.
now this is of course a pedagogical challenge, but being on radio, but can you sort of there's several terms in this learning rule. Like
Yeah.
it's essentially like the change of the weight with time is a product of things, right?
Yeah.
Or is it time?
That's
Yeah. What is it?
that.
Yeah.
So that's exactly right. So it's effectively a product of a presynaptic activity term. So
Mhm.
that encodes the arrival of a presynaptic spike with, again, filtered actually
Mhm.
by an EPSP shape, with a nonlinear function of the postsynaptic membrane potential. So that jives well with the ideas of voltage-based learning rules, actually,
Mhm.
times an error term, and that's error term is again a term that needs to be somehow communicated to the neuron, and it's reminiscent of gradient descent and now
Mhm.
back propagation, where this kind of local error goes backwards through the network.
Mhm.
So these three terms need to be multiplied with each other. And it's, of course, very nice because you have a presynaptic term, you have a postsynaptic voltage-based term, which is very close to what we all along thought actually biological learning rules are doing. Um,
Mhm.
and then you have this error-driven term that essentially decides on the sign of the update. So that's the key thing that it needs to do. Should this neuron have an instant ago spiked more, or less. That's what this term communicates, if you want.
Yeah, but this error signal, so that's because that's if you're in a multi-layer network, is this the error signal is that at the end?
Right. So the error signal essentially comes out of the derivative of the van Rossum distance at the end. So
Uh-huh.
you're absolutely right. There is now a spatial credit assignment problem. How does this error signal from the end get to
Hmm.
the hidden layer neurons?
Yeah.
And that's another ingredient in the paper that we took. So we took an idea by Timothy Lillicrap and colleagues, which at the time was called feedback alignment. So they realized that you don't necessarily have to give the feedback through the transpose weight matrix, which for biological purposes was always deemed as not plausible,
Yeah.
but
So what
that you
does
can
mean?
use
Yeah. So how would that translate in terms of weights? So meaning that it does it's not necessarily very specific, that it's not or from to
that's
that
right.
will,
So
the
so
everything is not particular for like just like one connection. Is that what it means or?
That's right. So in the hidden layer, each neuron needs to receive an error signal that is different, and
Mhm.
it has to do with what its own output to the downstream neuron is like.
Mm.
So suppose it's an inhibitory neuron, and you want the output neuron to spike more, then the inhibitory neuron should spike less in the hidden
Mm.
layer, right?
Mm.
So at the very least, would need to know if you want about its output um, weight
Mm.
sign or the sign of the output weight, and ideally you would backpropagate for this spatial credit assignment the output error to that neuron by flipping this sign. Now, what Tim Lillicrap and colleagues found is that even if you don't do that, in networks that are not too deep, where maybe now
Mm.
depth it goes well, maybe up to 4 hidden layers or so.
Mm.
If you're not too deep, if you just randomly backpropagate this through a random sign, it also works simply because in some cases you will get it right. In some cases you'll get it wrong, but because the downstream layers are also learning, you learn to ignore the wrong signal that you get from upstream neurons, or you can even learn to flip
Mm.
the weight so that the feedback is aligned. Hence the name. So that's why they call this feedback alignment. That the forward weights actually learn to make efficient use of the feedback they're getting if it's
So
wrong.
then, in some sense, it's not the sign of the error signal that matters; it's more the magnitude.
I think it's both, but
Yeah.
what you can show
But if the
theoretically.
sign is random, oh, or maybe it's because yeah.
So I think the intuition, you have absolutely the right intuition, but what you can think about, if you think about the gradient being an object in a high dimensional space, and now you
Mm.
approximate it with an approximation like feedback alignment, and if you think about the cosine angle between these two,
Mm.
yeah, of course, you want this to be one ideally, but it's not going to be one. But as long as the sign is correct on all of them, you'll be within a 90-degree cone
Mm.
or 180-degree cone. So you will still go down the hill instead of going up the hill, and that's the
Mm.
key.
Yeah.
So if the signs are correct, you're guaranteed to to
Mm.
to not make it worse,
Mm.
and that's usually enough.
And then, I mean, when you so of course we come back to the results, but you also say that it sort of is. I mean, it's a Hebbian rule, right? So it has a Hebbian element. It's like a modified Hebbian thing. So just sort of so everyone is on board here. What's the Hebbian element? What does it take for a synaptic rule to have an Hebbian element?
Right. So the Hebbian element is usually thought of being the pre times the postsynaptic activity element. So that's in the rule. And then technically speaking, it's a three-factor rule because there's this error element that then determines
Mm.
how this Hebbian element plays out.
Exactly, and like the maybe like the most like the traditional way to think about or like how the Hebbian ID is presented is that it's like this presynaptic spikes and the postsynaptic spikes. But here it's not the presynaptic spikes, but the postsynaptic potentials.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think it's very crucial
Mm.
for the following reasons. Is like consider the case where there's a hidden layer neuron that doesn't spike at all,
Yeah. No, that's
which can
not
happen.
not much
And
learning.
and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
now you want this network to solve a task which requires this neuron to spike, right? So
Mm.
and one
Yeah.
way of actually acquiring this spike is if
Mm.
this postsynaptic term is the potential.
Yeah. And this is something that has been sort of seen experimental. That's quite established. That is sort of is also from experiments.
Yes, I think this is very well established that you need postsynaptic calcium,
Hmm.
and that can come in either through spiking or just depolarization.
Exactly. So postsynaptic. Exactly. You need calcium in there.
Yeah.
Exactly. Hmm. Cool. So then it's also this term eligibility trace. That
Right.
is what is the it's all this so what's the that I think you say it's sort of like the change of the weight essentially like an error signal and time integral of the error signal times the eligibility trace over the duration of this kernel, I guess. So or yeah. So but so what's meant by the term eligibility trace?
Right. So by the term, we mean that each
Mm,
synapse has a short-term memory, if you want, about
mm,
how it in the recent past influenced the membrane potential,
mm,
and this gets and then there's a further memory about this happening in the past. So that's the eligibility trace. So it's really a trace about the coincidence of a presynaptic spike and the postsynaptic depolarization that was high,
mm.
and that's stored. For instance, in biology, this could be a calcium transient at a spine.
Yeah.
But now no plasticity has happened yet. What needs to happen now while this trace is up is that you get this error signal that now tells you,
Mm,
now convert this in an actual synaptic spike. So these three things have to come together. And at the technical level, what it does, it solves what's called temporal credit assignment.
mm. Okay. Yeah. So it sort of is a measure of whether you are in the learning mode or not, whether the synapse is in the interested in learning in some sense, or because
In
if the
some sense,
eligibility
yes.
trace is zero, right, then it doesn't matter what the error signal is. You just have
That's exactly right. So
yeah.
it measures whether the synapse actually could have contributed to this error.
Ah,
And because you need to remember, so the computation of a spiking network takes time, right? So it's all
ah,
causal. So
ah,
there is the error signal is always going to come late,
mm,
right? So because time from the input to the output is
mm,
already over. Now you
ah,
compute the error signal. It will take time to get back to that neuron.
sure.
So for that duration, you need to remember what you
Ah.
did 20 milliseconds ago.
Exactly. Ah, I
Yeah.
see. So that's interesting. So you expect maybe like then like bigger animals like humans, for example, to have a longer it has a longer time delay between the so it is the eligibility trace has to last longer somehow. The memory has to last longer for the than in a small animal or like a mouse. I don't know. This is maybe that's
Yeah,
very difficult to say.
that's a very very interesting thought.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about this deeply, but it could be. I
Yeah.
think what I would definitely expect is that these traces might be different in different brain areas, even in the same animal, simply because the error signal might
Yeah.
take different amounts of time to get there.
That's true. And some of these, like, I mean, the animals which are acting really slow, like turtles, maybe has to have longer compared to mice, which I have a feeling that they respond much faster to things. Anyway, so good. So now you have this new rule, and then of course you tested it, and then it. I just heard this podcast with your Dan Goodman, which you of course know, where there was a podcast, very nice podcast on brain inspired, another podcast series, which I highly recommend. And he said, "Well, SuperSpike just works." He said, so is that of course that's sort of the proof of the pudding. It's sort of whether it works or not. So, but how much? I mean, so how did you test it? Like, how did you in this SuperSpike paper? How did you check for the accuracy?
Right. So as I said, we really focused only on the credit assignment part and the learning part with supervised learning. So
Hmm.
we really came up with a bunch of supervised learning tasks. Like, and the ones that are most interesting are the ones that actually need a hidden layer to solve the problem. So
Hmm.
we tested first nonlinearly separable problems like XOR
Hmm.
in some kind of spiking setting. That's
Oh.
one way where we could then show if you remove the hidden layer, the problem doesn't get solved.
But why do
And
you? So X or is that the problem where you?
That's the exclusive OR problem
Yeah, yeah,
where,
sure.
yeah.
But exclusive or problem, but it's still a quite. I mean, does that involve time, like a spatial temporal?
So we had to make it a spatial
Okay,
temporal problem,
okay.
but
Oh,
usually it doesn't. You're absolutely right.
oh yeah. Mm.
At the time, we didn't really know what's a good
Mm.
problem to solve with time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why then also we just show that you can draw pretty picture output spike trains.
Yeah, I
That's
see.
another test that we did, that you
Mm.
can learn a target spike train.
Okay.
But we needed to essentially make sure that it also learns useful representation in the hidden layer, which is crucial to
Yeah.
all learning. Yeah.
So that for that task you produced, you also saw that without that X, that's this XOR variant where time is involved. Then you sort of the hidden layer was key.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then so yeah, exactly. And the training time was. I mean, did you also try it on other tasks, or what kind of tasks did you try it on then?
So in this work, we didn't try it on very difficult tasks,
Mm,
because we implemented this all from scratch,
mm,
with a very high temporal resolution. Like people who like spiking networks usually like to go to zero point 0.1 millisecond time step,
mm,
um, integration time step. And so then it became computationally very difficult for us to do much bigger problems, simply because the learning rule at
mm,
its heart requires to compute the product between a presynaptic activity, the nonlinear function of the postsynaptic membrane, and
mm.
this needs to be per synapse, needs to be convolved. What that means is
Okay.
each synapse requires, uh, essentially we implement it through double linear filtering. So each synapse requires two differential equations that need to be updated in every time step. That
Mm.
makes the algorithm quite costly, and originally limited us to small problems because we didn't have a GPU implementation at the time.
Ah, okay. But now, so now, I mean, it's of course it's much more costly than like a standard rate-based uh, model, right? So
Yes.
it's still heavy going. So it's but as I said, I mean, but there are problems where time is critical or essential, where this standard rate-based maybe doesn't work or so well, or
Yeah. So what we see is, that for problems where time is essential, that that with a learning rule like ours, we can go to very high temporal resolutions
uh,
without having to go to insanely high firing rates that would track in these short time bins, the
exactly.
output.
I see. Yeah,
In
because I
principle,
mean,
you can make it sparse. Yeah.
yeah. So this exactly. So the because of course you have this time dependent firing rates, the way you sort of unroll these models in time, right? So
Yeah.
they are probably much easier to train, but they have limitations in how finely resolved things can they can.
So I think depending on how you simulate, the spiking networks still unfortunately have the same limitations if you do it in discrete time and not an
Yeah.
event-based approach.
Uh,
Um, but yeah, the limitation usually for training recurrent neural networks is that if you have too many time steps, back propagation through time
mm,
becomes very expensive because you need to store in memory all the time steps before
I
you can
see.
go back.
Yeah.
And this is an issue also for deep learning applications.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, at the moment, there are sort of like there are there. I mean, I think it's really cool to to have like these spike-based spike learning rules. But are there applications where you sort of would need this? Do you have any particular applications at the moment where this spike, you should do it with spikes and your super spike learning rule?
Right. So this is twofold, basically. On the one
Mm,
hand, of course, the application is pure research because we want to know the code of the brain. But I think you are asking more for like engineering applications, and there we're working on interesting problems related actually to audio processing. We have a collaboration with GNA, so Jabra, where we're interested in doing denoising, for instance, for the RX or the TX side.
ah,
So this
what
would
is the
require.
RX and TX? What does that mean?
So this is like on the sender side or the receiver side. So,
Okay.
so for instance, if you have a noise canceling headphone,
Okay.
where
Yeah.
where of course there can be environmental noise that gets into your headphones, so you want to suppress that so you don't hear the noise. But also when you're sending audio to somebody on the phone, you don't want them to hear the church tower in the background while it's ringing, but you just want to hear their speech. So we're working on that. Because here a low latency is required. You need a high temporal resolution because it's audio, and you want to be incredibly power efficient, because I don't know whether you have seen them, but these little earplugs with Bluetooth, they don't have a
Yeah.
big
Yeah.
battery. So you want this
Yeah.
to be as efficient as possible. So this is what
Hmm.
we're currently evaluating as a
Ah,
possible implementation. And of course, once you go to neuroprosthetics or implants, this power efficiency is really key.
yeah. And I guess the key thing here is that like they probably take much more time to train these spiking networks. But once they are trained, then it's maybe the power consumption is lower.
So I think if you run it on conventional hardware, then the power consumption will remain an issue. I think
Mm.
the promise of this being more efficient is if you go to more brain inspired
Ah,
hardware or wetware like that our brain uses, where you don't have differential equations that implement this on each synapse, but literally you just have a leaky membrane where stuff leaks out, and it's almost for free by
yeah,
physics if you want. So
exactly. So like neuromorphic computing, I guess.
that's
Right?
exactly
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, cool. So are you also working? Are there ways to I remember I had this talk to this what's called this guy Marcus Covert. I think he was at Stanford. He made this really this model of the whole cell, what's going on inside cells, and the first version was sort of was took really long to run, and then sort of this when I sort of tested the model much later or a few years later, it was sort of like orders of magnitude faster, it seemed. Then I just asked him sort of what's the change here, and he said, well, it's like computer engineers, right? I mean, if you have, I mean, like, so is there a big chance of improving the like making the algorithm much better if you have like professional computer engineer? I don't know what, but I mean, typically neuroscientists and physicists or whatever are not sort of trained in optimizing these things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that has also propelled in deep learning successes in the last years was that big players like Google or Facebook made their deep learning libraries publicly available,
Yeah,
and they're really good software
yeah,
engineers that develop this and make this efficient and then make it use the hardware in the right way. And of course, there are people who develop the hardware. Let's not forget
yeah,
where there's been really great strides that
yeah,
we've seen. Now, this
yeah.
hardware is not tailored to spiking neural networks, which is
Hmm.
why they're still more of an academic problem. But it's clear to most people that if you can exploit sparsity
Yeah,
and aspects that also the brain uses, that this should
yeah.
also confer power advantages to then
Yeah,
specialized
because
hardware.
I guess in the AI world, one of the major worries now is the power consumption, like these like large language models and it's like a enormous
That's
amount
exactly
of
right.
power that is needed. So cool. But now back to the brain, because you had this really cool paper um, from your group that came out, I guess, this fall in 2023. It's about like how do the brains do it, and so there was like this new kind of learning rule. It's now called latent predictive learning, and but then so and then it's and then you also said this is uh, this is a sort of what's called self-supervised learning rule. So it's which is just like a subclass or a class or a group of unsupervised learning, or like a set of unsupervised. So what is self-supervised learning? You briefly mentioned it earlier, but
Right. So far we talked about supervised learning where you give a target. Now in self-supervised learning, this target is not given by you, so you don't need to hand label your data, but it's somehow generated automatically from the data. And one
mm,
way of thinking about it is that what you're trying to do is, for instance, prediction. So if you have temporal data,
mm,
one thing you could try to do is you could try to predict the next instant in time, what's going to be your input. Right. So in a
yeah,
sense, you're
into your own neuron, like so it's a local thing. So yeah,
For instance, yeah, it can be a local thing, can be a network thing. So you're trying to predict the next token. So actually, large language models are precisely trained like this. So GPT, ChatGPT, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. They're trying to predict the next word in a sentence, and that's how they learn. So all you need to feed us is lots of sentences. And now, what's very interesting is how do you generalize this to data sets that are not countable, right? So words, there may be 200,000 words, so you can have a big softmax at the output, you can count them, you can predict what's the next word. But if you have images or audio, there are many, many, many more possible inputs. You can't have a big softmax of all possibilities. It's impossible.
Just
So
about what softmax is, just to.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So softmax is an activation function that models a probability distribution. It's a soft version of a maximum function that picks the most active neuron in the output.
Exactly. So it's like almost like a winner mostly takes all, sort of. Or
That's exactly right. It's a soft winner take all
yeah, I
version.
see. Okay. Good. Yeah, and then okay, so this is. But you, okay, I think I interrupt you. So then the goal is sort of to be able to predict. So then you predict, say, like the next word or something, and if you're able to do that, then you get a reward.
Yes, you get even more than a reward because you get even usually a much higher dimensional, more rich feedback. You get the right answer.
Yeah.
It's not just whether you're right or wrong, but you actually get told this is the answer to your prediction. So this can be for image, for instance, is a much richer, more high dimensional feedback, right? So in the language model, you get told which word it actually was. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can use this for learning. So it's almost as good as a label. Or it is basically a label, and you can use this for learning.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of a cool thing, and this idea that you sort of developed, then this so this new learning rule, latent predictive learning. So this so tell me about it. What was the idea behind this latent predictive learning? So you wanted to make first. You started with a. I mean, it was like a rate-based model you started with, right? Or it's like a not very, so not like a fast temporal dynamics. It was sort of about getting to a more biologically and biologically plausible learning rule that maybe could do similarly good as supervised learning. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was one of the motivations for us. The question was, if you have a sensory network, how does it? In the paper, we use the example: how do you distinguish cats and dogs? Something that we can do easily, and you children need only very few labels to understand what's a cat, what's a dog, even though both have fur and four paws. So we were asking, how can you do this without supervision? And that was the question that was driving this research. So what goes in, as I already mentioned it earlier, is predictions. You're trying to predict the next instant in time, and you're trying to predict in latent space, as the name of the learning rule that you just mentioned
Yeah, just tell what
suggests.
latent space is.
So latent space is the space at the output of the network. So
Okay.
as opposed to a generative model, the prediction is not an image, but it's an activity vector at the output end of the network. So let's suppose the dog, the first dog image goes into your network, goes through, generates an output. What's going to be the next output after you've consumed the next image?
So it's like an internal representation of a dog. So.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And then you can sort of test sort of whether it is. Yeah. So then you would like a successful network like this should have a quite different internal representation of cats and dog if it's, is that sort of like the idea? That's a
the
success.
basic idea, yeah.
Okay, now to the rule. So it's so it was some kind of, it had an tell me about the, okay, so what was the rule you made?
Right. So the rule we made has a component that tries to predict the future in latent space and tries to make this prediction as accurate as possible. And there's one problem, that if you're only trying to do this naively, so if you're trying to optimize the network and you tell it, I want this embedding in the activity in the latent space, I want to be as similar as possible for one input and the other, that there's a trivial solution. And the trivial solution is that the network learns to just create one constant output
Okay.
It's always the perfect prediction, and
Exactly.
it's always perfectly useless. Right? So
Exactly.
you need to prevent it from doing this
So,
this trivial
so
solution.
exactly. So
And
it's like if you sort of show like cats and dog pictures, all you can say it's an animal.
yeah, it's a cat or a dog.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's
Uh,
always right, but
yeah.
it's also perfectly
Exactly.
useless.
Not the most exciting.
So
Okay.
you need something that prevents this collapse of a constant output. And one
Mhm.
way of doing this is to say I want a high entropy in the output, or I want a high variance in the output.
High entropy. What does that mean?
Yeah, I want a variable
Yeah.
output, not a
Mm.
constant output.
No. Exactly. That's because then you end up with the same classification of all.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
And then once we realized this was exciting, because we realized that that's precisely why for the last 40 years or so, people have thought what Hebbian learning does. So
Mm.
Hebbian learning can be derived from a variance maximization principle or entropy maximization principle.
Mm.
You get Hebbian plasticity out. But if you put Hebbian plasticity in a network, usually it doesn't learn cats and dogs. It learns something, but it never really amounted to really keeping them separate. So the
Mm.
idea was we should combine this predictive aspect on the one hand with the Hebbian plasticity that we know happens in sensory networks in the brain, and that they could work together and enable useful learning by one
Mm.
preventing the collapse and the other one by forming representations that predict more better the
Mm.
future input.
Yeah. And then you made this learning rule, uh, which is then sort of something called. I mean, there was like this. I remember when I started doing entering neuroscience in the mid 90s. Then one thing I learned about was this BCM learning rule. And that this was called Bienenstock Cooper Monroe learning rule, which was sort of already had been around for quite a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
what is this rule about?
So this rule is one of a very solidly theoretically founded Hebbian plasticity rules that has been around since the 80s. Another one is Oya's rule.
Mm.
Um, so Oya's rule, maybe in short, actually is derived from the variance maximization principle. The BCM rule from a entropy maximization
Yeah.
principle. It predicts a very particular shape of the learning curve if you plot the postsynaptic activity versus the weight change.
Mm.
It predicts that there is, for low activity levels, there's LTD, so long-term depression
Mm. So then the
of the
weight gets
synapse.
smaller. Mm.
Exactly. And then there's a threshold, and for higher activity levels, you get potentiation. So
Mm.
it's a very Hebbian in nature concept. So it also predicts that this should happen during co-activity of pre and postsynaptic activity,
Mm.
but that the decision of whether you get depression or potentiation should be made postsynaptically.
Mm.
And there's quite some experimental evidence for that learning rules look somewhat like this.
Mm.
Another main prediction of BCM was, however, that it has a moving threshold, which has to move for stability reasons. So if you only get potentiation for a long time, the prediction is that this threshold moves higher and higher, so that it catches up with the actual activity, and also sometimes you get depression to regulate down the activity. So that was
Mm.
a key for actually getting selectivity.
Would you say it like was like sorry, theoretical? Theoretical, had good theoretical foundations. This BCM rule. So what kind of so what was the principles that was behind developing this BCM rule?
The principle is that you take the entropy of your output variable and you maximize it.
Okay, and then that depends on, and then you get
You,
this
you minimize it,
threshold.
sorry. But
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah, very good. By the way, I met this because I used to do semiconductor physics back in the days, or solid state physics, and then of course it's C in the BCM theory. That's the Cooper, who is like this Cooper pairs and got the Nobel Prize for superconductivity, explaining superconductivity.
Yeah, it's the BCS theory. Yeah.
BCS theory, exactly. So I was sort of, so he was, yeah, that was cool. I actually met him at when I entered neuroscience in '95. I met he was one of the teachers at this methods in computation neuroscience course at Woods Hole back in the day. So that was quite exciting too. So I think I was one of the few guys who actually asking about the BCS theory also, but not in the
Nice.
lecture, but on the private. So anyway, so that was cool. And you say that one of the advantages with this rule you had is that it doesn't require labels, meaning that it doesn't have to have there's no supervised learning, but also it doesn't require negative samples. What is meant by negative samples?
Right. Um, so so usually when we observe the world as animals, as you put it
Mm.
earlier,
Yeah.
we see a dog running, and
Mm.
an instant later there's still a dog running. It's not
Yeah.
magically converting into Gaute, for instance.
No.
So
I see.
otherwise, if they're changing something in the matrix, so to
Yeah.
speak, that's not usually happening.
Exactly. No.
So that's what's a positive sample. You get a
Yeah.
sensory input, and then the moment later you get another sensory input, and they're usually related
Okay. Mm.
causally. So a negative sample would be the change into Gaute. So there's some
Okay.
magic, and the image changes completely, and you get a
I see.
completely different input.
Interesting.
So this is not something that an animal would ever see unless you're in some virtual
Yeah.
reality experiment where the experimenter can mess with reality.
Yeah.
Um, but it's one way of avoiding the collapse I mentioned earlier, for which we use a Hebbian plasticity term in the learning rule. But another way is that you can have a predictive term and an anti-predictive term if you want, and you
Okay.
switch them. So you say you want positive samples to predict each other, and negative samples you want to be as different in the output as possible. So you have a negative sign in
Mm.
there, and you want to make them very different.
I
And that
see.
way you
I see.
avoid the trivial solution.
I see. A little bit cheating or whatever. Yeah. Well
It
thought.
works. It
Yeah. It
works,
works.
but
Yeah.
it's not an option for the brain if you
But
just consume
the normal.
the normal world.
Yeah. So cool. So that's something that comes out, and then and this. So when you talk about predictive, that the predictive element of this rule is really that things doesn't change really rapidly in time. Is that really so? That is some kind of like this continuity thing. If you sort of saw a dog a second ago, it's
Yeah.
probably a dog now also, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that's so it's also something called what's called a slow feature analysis. That's an element that is yeah. So I guess this is sort of so that's but is that also the network and the end is if you start showing it sort of like this really unnatural situations where you switch from dog to Gaute immediately, it'll have a or dog dog to cat that if it's trained on dog and cats, then it can be fooled.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So that is right. So that's
Mhm.
actually one of the experiments I did because that we did in the paper, because this is an experiment that has been done in reality on
Mhm.
monkeys by Nuo Lee and Jim DiCarlo.
Okay.
So, and in this case, monkeys are watching a screen, and they're shown different images, and the experimenters track the eyes of the monkey,
Mhm.
and then in some situations, so suppose there's an object appearing in your periphery, you usually do a saccade. Monkeys do the same thing, and in some situations, they switch the object while the monkey is performing the saccade.
Okay. Yeah.
And they do this consistently for specific objects, and they find that the representations in IT, so in inferior temporal cortex, a brain area that's known to encode object
Huh.
identity to a certain degree with invariance, changes.
Huh.
Meaning that even in adult animals and their visual system, there seems to be some kind of learning going on, which is unsupervised and
Mhm.
based on this type of temporal contiguity.
Mhm.
And the model can reproduce these
Huh.
results very
Huh.
easily.
All right, cool. So okay, so now you had this had this learning rule, LPL learning rule, and then you tested it on like in a multi-layer model with some kind of yeah. Uh, I don't know how many layers you typically included in your tests.
Yeah, so I'm blanking on how many, but
Yeah,
around 10.
around 10. Okay, yeah, no, that's
I think if I remember correctly, it's a VGG-like model.
okay.
Um,
Okay, so
and
it's
so
like an
it's
order of 10 layers, so it's not
yeah,
like two.
yeah.
So exactly, and then you showed some what kind of images did you train it on?
So for one test, we used something that's known as image augmentations as
Mhm.
positive samples. So the way you do this is you take a mother image. Let's say one is Manu's dog, for instance. Manu is the first author of this study,
Mhm.
and then you crop it in random locations, and you show the network different crops. one after the
Cropping, you
other.
mean like parts of the image?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
basically, we made a very lightweight fake video
yeah.
of these images to
Yeah.
reduce the computational load,
Okay.
or you apply some blur,
Yeah,
or you flip the image,
yeah.
and this is what's
And
shown to the
shrink it
network.
also maybe, or
Sometimes you shrink it, you zoom
yeah,
in, you zoom out. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Cool. So then you had these, and then how many categories did you? I mean, you had dogs, and you had like a
Yeah, we tested this on two data sets with 10 categories. So in the end, for the learning, it doesn't matter because you don't need the labels. But in the
mm,
end, to assess success of the
mm,
representations, what we needed was a supervised data set so we could see whether now on the output of the network we can classify better. And for this, we used the linear classifier
mm.
to probe
Huh.
um, the
And
representations.
so that was sort of the thing. If you based on the output from this multi-layer network, all the nodes could sort of predict whether sort of it was a
Cat or
dog
dog.
or a cat, then it was like then the representations must be different, because if they
Yeah,
were the
yeah,
same, they wouldn't sort of yeah,
yeah, and
exactly. And how well did it do?
so it did, in comparison to what Hebbian plasticity alone did before,
Yeah.
incredibly well.
Okay.
It's not 100% yet at the same level as supervised learning algorithms,
Mm,
but then again, usually you should give it more data. We only gave it the data from the supervised data set, so in the sense
mm,
we should have done actually bigger data set for a fair comparison.
mm,
Um, but it went on Cypher 10 or STL10, it went up to like 60, 70% accuracy, whereas maybe then with supervised learning, you would get 80.
yeah.
So
And then with only Hebbian,
you would get 20 here. So yeah,
exactly, because that's also something you test to turn it off. There's
exactly.
different
Yeah,
terms and so
yeah,
what's
yeah,
and they were
yeah.
all important. And then it also that it actually also helped to have many layers. It's so not that they got the same quality with 3 layers.
That's right. That's something we already, yeah, we kind of expected because that's what deep learning is all about, making the networks deep, and that this is crucial for generalization.
Yeah.
And here we now also saw one of the first times that actually with a local learning rule in the end, and
Mm,
plus decorrelation, you actually learn something useful using this depth.
mm. And then, but this, I mean, like coming back to this, like the motivation. It's not that there's like some supervised learning. I mean, you imagine that this in biology, you get some examples, some supervised learning. This is a cat, this is a cat, and then you tell your child, and then based on that, combined with something like this rule, that is sort of maybe how it works.
Yeah, I mean,
Or I mean, it's just speculation, of course. I mean, I'm not
of
going
course,
to.
that's the
Yeah,
speculation, but I do think
yeah,
that I do firmly believe at the moment that our brain does something like self-supervised learning, and
mm,
it learns from to extract useful features from just the temporal
yeah,
aspect from
yeah,
the input.
yeah. Interesting. I mean, this. I don't know if you know this. I just heard this podcast. It was also brain inspired about this guy. I don't remember was it somewhere in the U.S. who had this like reared this chicken
Hmm.
because in this dark environment and then hatched them in this virtual environment so that all the chickens that ever seen had sort of he had control over, right? So he could do all this kind of avoid this, for example, presenting this continuous data, right? So it seems like this is possible to at least test in animals. This kind of what about if you're yeah if sort of like turn off the kind of data that helps you to do predictive coding, I guess, and see if that changes
Yeah.
things.
So I'm not familiar with the chicken work, but
Right.
so David Zocolan's lab at CISA, they do a very similar experiment in rats,
Okay.
and they do find that the rats reared in the cage that where they're watching on all sides frame shuffled video
Uh,
don't have complex cells or not as many complex cells in the higher visual areas. So that's of course very consistent with the idea that the brain uses this prediction for learning.
mhm.
There's an important confound that, of course, that if you're changing image statistics so drastically, that all kinds of things might change, and it's very
Uh,
difficult to
yeah.
know for certain. But I totally think it's that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And then, of course, then now you had this rule that seemed to like was very promising, exciting results for this rate-based version, and then you tried to do the same thing for spiking neurons.
That's
So
right. So
yeah,
having already the hammer
uh,
for knowing how to now go from a loss function to a spiking neural network, we tried
mm,
this also with a small spiking neural network,
mm,
and it similarly finds the predictive most relevant inputs as expected. So that's very
yeah.
um,
I mean, it also found that it. I don't know. There was also this thing that you also got into this asynchronous irregular regime, right? So it's like that's like, I mean, if it so you both, after learning it, both got into this asynchronous irregular regime, which is sort of like a sign that it's doing something cortical like, maybe. But it
maybe.
also was able to 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 learn and predict this.
Yeah.
But how was the, yeah, maybe you didn't use the same task, maybe, so it was but difficult to compare.
Yeah, so the task was much simpler in this case.
Oh.
It was just a network with one hidden layer, again
Mm,
for computational reasons. And the task was different populations of input spike trains that followed Poisson statistics, so groups of
mm,
neurons with Poisson statistics with an inhomogeneous, so changing firing rate over time.
mm,
And we controlled how they changed the firing rate, and basically, so a slow change in firing rate makes to some extent the future predictable,
mm,
and this is what the network then got interested in. If the change is too slow, however, like for a constant input,
mm.
this learning rule finds it also boring and it chooses to ignore it. So it
Yeah.
really picks inputs that kind of vary on a specific time scale, almost like a bandpass filter,
Yeah.
and that's exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and that's what it does.
Cool. And it was, but it was quite small network, obviously, I guess, for computational reasons, 100 excitatory and 25
Yeah.
inhibitory neurons. And then you ran it for, you said 28 hours, but that's biological time, or 28 hours biological time?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So this was then with a zero point 0.1 millisecond time step. So
Okay. So, but
that
so
takes time.
well, yeah. So, but was the what kind of computer did you use? Could you do it on a normal
Yeah,
office
yeah,
computer?
yeah. Yeah, no, I do this on my desktop, but yeah, the simulation runs almost in real time. So, but then it takes 24 hours roughly.
Oh
So
yeah,
it's
but that's
a bit
fine.
faster.
That's just like a weekend.
That's just like a weekend. If you
Yeah.
forget about parameter tuning, exactly.
Well, they just come in on the on Saturday and just put in. Anyway,
But that is the reason why it's 100 neurons. So we could
yeah,
run it in real time. Yeah.
yeah. So, but is that sort of a and well, and one thing that came out of this, because I mean, as I said, I mean the I mean this traditional picture, the thing I sort of like the textbook, what textbooks, like at least not too advanced textbooks, tells about this spike timing dependent plasticity, are this like this or STDP, these STDP rules, where sort of if the pre becomes comes before spike, and then it's like an enhanced, and if it's a post comes before pre, then it's like the weight is decreased. And this is something that came out of this.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so,
Yeah,
so this was very exciting to see
yeah,
that the learning rule, even though it was based on a normative principle of prediction, it could produce spike timing dependent plasticity, even though it was not designed
yeah.
to be a spike timing dependent plasticity rule.
Mhm.
This just came as the tip of the iceberg of the learning rule that came out. So if you ran an STDP protocol on this learning rule, it produces an STDP kernel.
And that depends on, and there's also this like this the textbook learning rule I just mentioned, that is sort of, that just came out in not all cases, it was depending on the activity of the network, right?
Yeah, again, you're right. So thanks for reading the paper carefully.
Yeah. Well, that's the,
so
well, that's half the fun of making the podcast, is actually on try to understand these things, right?
right. So
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier. So there's this component that does Hebbian learning, and there's the component that does the predictive learning, and they're actually antagonistic.
Mm.
So they're fighting each other. Hebbian plasticity tries to blow up the representation,
Uh,
make it a big sphere in the latent
mm.
space, and the predictive learning tries to pull it together. So they're really working against each other. And so they need some way of regulating that not one wins. And the way it's done in this learning rule is that there is a dependence on the variance of the activity. If the variance of the activity gets too high, the Hebbian plasticity gets shut off. And if the variance of the activity is too low, the Hebbian plasticity gets augmented. So this way, the learning group keeps in the balance. And so the neuron, what it needs to do is it needs to estimate um, deviations from its baseline firing rate over time with a moving average. And it does this. There's a sigma squared somewhere that's computed as a moving average as a proxy of variance that goes into the learning rule and makes it a metaplastic learning rule.
So it's how the plasticity rules change over time, or how they change over depending on activity. Yeah,
Correct.
yeah, that was
And
quite
so,
cool.
and depending on what this has as a current value, you actually end up with a standard classic STDP kernel, which is pre, before, post causes potentiation, or an anti-STDP kernel, which is to some extent a prediction of our model. That we argue that if the neuron has seen in the recent past a lot of variance, it should look like an anti-STDP learning rule.
Yeah, so that means that it's should be like the other. So then post before, post after pre should mean that it gets to get reduced. Yeah, or
Yeah, that's
something
right.
like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
That's right.
I know. So cool. Now this is really cool. So I mean, I mean, one thing with this plasticity rules, right? It's because I mean, I think if you look at the field from like a bird's eye perspective, bird's eye view, then I mean, we now doing fairly well in sort of making neural models for well, sort of for like, for example, iterate the fire type and fit these to experiments. I mean, like we mentioned, like often a lot of nice work, for example, done in Wolfram Gerstner's group on this. So, and then you can sort of actually fit the parameters of this neural model with sort of the rather modest. I mean, you don't have to run it forever, essentially, to get the data and need to fit it. At least not compared to that. And then you need to plug in essentially an electrode in the whatever in the neuron, and then like has some kind of stimulation protocol, and then use that data to fit the model. But with to like experimental or experimental exploration or fitting of the synaptic learning rules, that's much harder, isn't it? For I mean, for one thing, it's like many more. I mean, you have like if you have n neuron types, it's like n squared learning rules in some sense. All I mean, even if they are the same, and then it takes much longer to. Do you need much longer recordings?
Yes, I think there are multiple problems that make it difficult. First of all, as I said, there may be many different synaptic plasticity rules depending on the neuron type. So that's one issue. The other issue is you need to control, instead of one neuron, you need to control two neurons. So pre and the post synaptic neuron, meaning you need to usually patch them. And then not all neurons are connected, so you have a lot of failure of connection in that sense. So this makes these experiments very difficult. And then finally, as soon as you patch a neuron, you're changing a lot of its internal milieu, which can actually affect plasticity. So and you mentioned
You
already,
think
you don't get.
they change it more than the neuronal properties, maybe?
So definitely they will affect local calcium dynamics, which we
Yeah,
know are important for plasticity. So you're
yeah,
probably changing the learning rule itself.
yeah.
And now to fit a plasticity rule, you would have to repeatedly induce LTP, LTD over a long time. And usually once you patch the neuron, it starts
So a long
dying.
time, you mean like days almost,
This,
or
I
time?
think this would be, for theorists, would be the first thing to ask for. And then
Yeah,
an experimentalist will look at you, are you crazy?
yeah,
So, but I mean, people who handle this very well can maybe keep these neurons for hours, but that's already long.
yeah.
And it's very rare that one induces LTP and LTD in the same experiment. It's also difficult.
But even what about optical methods? Just optical stimulation, is that something which can help
Definitely,
here?
I think all optical methods. So you would need to read out and stimulate is a way
Mm.
to go. The problem is that to assess synaptic plasticity, to read out the weight,
Mm.
you need to have a tight handle on the postsynaptic voltage, because usually you measure that
Yeah,
as an
that's true.
EPSP.
Yeah,
So you need a voltage sensor
exactly. That's,
postsynaptically, or you
mm.
need a proxy. You need to monitor the size of the synaptic spine, which is believed to be a good proxy. But for this, you need then two photon setup that's very different. So it's still a difficult experiment to do. Yeah.
What can you learn from, well, from electron microscopy? But that's, of course, you don't get you don't get like dynamics there. But how much is sort of, maybe you can, yeah, let's then, I don't know how correlated these sort of like the weights of the synapses are to what you can anything you can see in the EM electron.
Right. So I mean, size would be a good proxy probably for weight,
Mm.
and these experiments are actually done here at the FMI by the group of Rainer Friedrich, and so
Mm.
they study zebrafish, and they induce learning in these animals before the brain is sliced and then actually mapped fully in EM. So in a couple of years, we might have some answers to your questions.
Excellent.
Um, of course, then yeah, it's a slow process which is not very scalable at the moment. You will get one, two, or five animals,
Mm. Yeah.
but I'm hopeful that I think at least if by the time we have good predictions of what we're looking for, that
Mm.
we can at least in individual animals look into the connectome and see whether we find it there.
But it's not only experimentalists are in trouble, because you would like, or make, or it's difficult to study this, because even with, I mean, like as a modeler, if you want to, usually when you do a simulation, or at least sort of kind of simulations that, well, I mean, typically where you're not interested in plasticity, you maybe can get your answers by simulating a network for some seconds of time, right? But here, if you want to explore effects of a learning rule, you need to run it for many hours, maybe many. So there's also that limitation. It's difficult to study a large network with these synaptic rules and learn the consequences.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely the search space is very large. The simulations are very heavy, so it's
Mm.
definitely not something where it's easy to do the brute force approach. So
Mm.
there, theory still helps a
Mm.
lot in guiding what candidate rules you
Mm.
actually think might be useful.
Yeah, what do you
And
mean theory? I mean, like not simulations, but
for instance, the normative approach that we took in our paper, where we
yeah.
said, okay, what makes sense, right? So
Mm.
what are the things you need to prevent collapse? You need to learn something maybe that's
Yeah.
predictive.
So you
Yeah.
can put in sort of a, yeah.
You
Huh?
constrain your space of possible learning rules.
Mm.
Tim Vogel's lab, where I'm also involved in,
Mm.
they were trying to take the more automated approach, and it's possible, but it's very heavy. It's
More automated
computationally
in terms of,
that you do gradient descent on learn on the space of learning rules if you want.
oh, I see.
So
Yeah. Okay.
you
I
lose
see.
it, use evolutionary strategies. You simulate a network for 20 minutes. You
Ah.
assess its activity,
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
and you parameterize your learning rule, and then you
Mm.
have a big cluster which
Yeah.
makes a lot of heat
Uh,
around Vienna,
yeah.
and then you
Heat
can
up.
do it. But
Yeah.
it's possible, but it's heavy.
Yeah. It's interesting how much sort of how much bigger computers would help many aspects of computational neuroscience. Not because they want to simulate, I mean, 100 billion neurons in the humans, or 100 million neurons in the mouse. It's just that we need to run much smaller models for a long time.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's sort of interesting. It's not the problem that people. Yeah. So anyway, so that's yeah, stronger computers, preferably who doesn't heat up Vienna when they're around there, would be really
Or
nice.
Basel for that matter, or
Yeah.
Norway.
Norway could help actually a little bit. We don't.
You don't mind the global warming, I see.
Well, at least right now, I could have like a few degrees warmer. I could live with that. So cool. But one cool thing is about your field is that sort of you have this AI community, right? With very resourceful, like very interested in these learning rules and spiking learning rules for AI applications. So I mean, I guess I mean, Google, Facebook, all the Microsoft, all the big ones are sort of like having big groups, and of course they attract really talented people also to work on this. So how much, and of course this is sort of adjacent at least to what you do. So how much can you benefit from that? I mean, anything that Google can do, they can probably do better. And anything they're interested in, then they can probably make a lot of progress.
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of these ideas, they've been largely driven by deep learning research, which of course was backed by big companies, big tech companies like Google, for instance,
Mhm.
and others. And or let alone mention the libraries like TensorFlow, PyTorch, right? So that has been a huge help for a lot of research
Yeah.
in various applied,
Yeah.
fundamental, everything, right? So
Mhm.
just that. So when I started, I still used Theano, which was a more academic library. Now my students, they don't even know what that is.
What is it? Piano? Is that one?
Theano. So
Piano. Okay.
that
Yep.
was the TensorFlow predecessor. And
I see. Yeah.
now I hear my students call people who use TensorFlow a boomer.
Okay.
So this is very fast paced. Now my lab is transitioning to JAX.
Okay.
Before it
Yeah.
was PyTorch. So like
Ah, yeah.
so these libraries actually
Yeah.
they are extremely helpful. For
That's true.
instance,
Yeah, because I just had this previous podcast recording with Konrad Kolding. He talked about Jacks, and I thought he meant this old book by Jack Noble and Tien. And so I was really felt like not even a boomer, like a pre-boomer.
dinosaur.
Yeah, exactly. So that's cool. Of course, it's really practical then, that you have these really nice tools, and you can have students who can work on this even if they don't have too much time, because they can sort of at least sort of, because the infrastructure of sort of making the models are sort of are there already. So, but one thing, it's sort of one thing I was thinking about this, this dictum or saying from Feynman: if you can, if I understand it, I can build it, right? And now sort of with this kind of this field here, especially AI, it sort of says that even if I can build it, I don't really understand it, right? So it's like this is really a strange, or it's like a new thing, I guess, for science, that you can build all these things that you don't understand really how it works, right? Because I guess like people like, I mean, I guess the first thing you, when you try out these different rules, I mean, you have the first thing is sort of, does it really work? And you have a success criteria, and then of course if you end up with something that works, then you can try to understand. If it doesn't work, of course there's some kind of uh, more general thinking that goes into maybe suggesting, like modifying a rule, trying something, one particular rule rather than the other. But it's sort of an interesting thing that we have all these things that we can build and don't understand.
Yeah. So there, let me push back a little bit because I do think we might have to revise our notion of understanding.
Hmm.
So what we call understanding, and I do think, yeah, a deep neural network. If you ask me, what does this weight do? Of course, I won't be able to understand it because there are millions, up to billions of weights.
Hmm.
But maybe that's also not the understanding we need, right? So
Hmm.
what I think is compelling about the approach is that there is a very simple, extremely simple
Yeah.
algorithm and an optimization objective,
Yeah.
and that where all the complexity that you see in the network actually comes from the data.
Hmm.
So the algorithm itself is very simple. It's very easy to understand.
Yeah.
You can explain it to
Yeah.
your kids.
Yeah.
And the complexity really comes from the real world because the other thing you need to put in is a lot of data.
Hmm.
And to some extent, the real world is complex.
Yeah.
Now, I can understand complicated things when I can put them in a scatter plot with two axes. Maybe
Yeah.
if I can put them in three axes. Of
Yeah.
course, now I cannot put the weights of a billion
Yeah.
parameters into a
Yeah.
plot that I can understand at this level. So it's a
Hmm.
different understanding.
Yeah.
But I do think as long as we really understand the algorithm
Hmm.
that brings us there, then that's already a lot. And I honestly, I think for the human brain, for animal brains, for the ones of mammals, where not each brain is a copy, like in flies or C. elegans, nematodes, the brains are identical. So then I think it's worthwhile pursuing this level of understanding of each
Hmm.
connection. But in larger mammals, each brain is different, right? So now should we invest a lot of energy into understanding my brain or your brain, and then it doesn't tell us anything about the next person's brain, or should we rather understand the principles that build these brains, starting from an embryo and
Hmm.
then to a fully formed human being or an animal.
Yeah.
And I think we should focus on the algorithms. And I think the framework of optimization is one compelling framework to think about the algorithm and writing it down in very complex ways.
But I guess if we had like, if you sort of started with sort of just the human brain, like having all, and we're able to sort of to make some kind of learning rule that sets up a network, and I mean you wouldn't, and that was able to mimic the behavior of human brains, you wouldn't sort of like concepts like ion channels or even, well, I mean it would, I mean lots of concepts which are important for, at least for me, to think about the brain doesn't necessarily emerge, right? And but I mean that's, of course, we were lucky that I mean there are things like physical things like ion channels in cells, so that's why they emerge. And maybe the simplest thing, so the idea is that maybe the simplest thing you can say about the brain when it comes to function is really just a learning rule.
Yeah, so I think two things here that I should say. So clearly, for a modeler, it's important that we find the principles that gets us to a network that actually performs a computational function. That's arguably one of the constraints given by biology where networks compute, where brains compute. So if I want to understand this, I'm happy to abstract away ion channels. Now, I'm also interested in biomedical research. I mean, we're not doing this only because we would just like to understand it for the fun of it. That's, of course, a large part of fundamental research. But ultimately, of course, there are many debilitating diseases that you would like to tackle once you have
Absolutely.
some form of understanding, right?
Yeah.
And there, the ion channels will become important because they are ultimately targets for proteins or drugs that you might want to develop. But I think there's no point in if you don't have the basic mechanism to get a functional network to already put in ion channels. They will not magically make this intelligent. They will just make it more complex. And I think one needs to walk backwards and forwards. We need to basically take this top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. And ultimately, these approaches need to meet.
Absolutely. No, there I think I completely agree. So we're well approaching the end of the podcast, but I think one thing that is really been nice about what you're, I mean, you have one of these well, maybe new generation of scientists that also tries to build a community or support the community. So you have this what's called snoofa. That is sort of
That's
like a nice initiative. What is that? I think with Dan Goodman and one more person from Dan Goodman's lab or something, or
right. So there are multiple things, but what this all is built around is the SNUFA workshop. So SNUFA stands for Spiking Neural Networks as Universal Function Approximators.
okay,
And it's a little bit of a pun with snafu.
yeah,
Situation normal, everything
yeah,
fucked up, all fucked up. But no, so SNUFA, easy to remember and easy to Google, is an annual workshop that started during the pandemic with Dan Goodman, where we thought we should have a meeting for spiking networks. And because of the pandemic, it became an online meeting. So we thought we can open it up to the public. And we thought there would be just 25 nerds showing up, and then it were like 700 people from all time zones. So some people stayed up very, very late to attend the talk. So this was great. And then we realized, okay, clearly this community needs this dedicated workshop specifically for spiking neural networks. So we decided to continue it. And due to the widespread interest international, we decided to keep it even post-pandemic. We decided to keep it online. And then on top of this, there's a Discord channel where also one of Dan Goodman's postdocs is involved in managing this, and their
what is it?
seminars.
Discord? What's it called?
It's basically like Slack, but just for Slack is for boomers, I guess. And then so it's a chat. It's a chat thing.
Okay, where you can discuss things. Yeah,
Exactly.
and
So
that's also for everyone, right?
that's also for everyone. Yeah. So you find the links if you go to www.snoofa.net. You'll
Okay,
find
that's
both the
good.
workshops and the
Yeah,
links to the Discord channel.
I'll make the links at the homepage of the episode.
Great, thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
so that's cool. But I think it's also, I was just in I was Latin America in January, and also like visiting some labs in Buenos Aires, and also teaching at this LASCON, Latin American School of Computational Neuroscience, and it sort of just strikes me. It's sort of that there is this, well, with a European perspective, the people I typically met at like these physical meetings, they were either like typically from North America or Europe, and occasional Asian or two, but I mean typically very few people from Latin America, even though there's a big community there. Obviously, just for practical reasons, expensive to fly or whatever. So it's, but this is sort of now with internet, there's so many possibilities, and sort of trying to sort of at least, not that physical meetings are not important, but to have these virtual meetings or like meetings over internet, I think is so important to try to actually to make a world community. So I think what you're doing is really really important. So thanks a lot for doing that. So. Very good. That was sort of what I planned to have on my list of things I wanted to learn from your two excellent papers. So thanks a lot for coming to the podcast, Friedemann.
Thanks a lot, Gaute. This was really fun. And I should also say, because you're praising the community efforts, I think it's great to have this podcast. So
Yeah.
thanks for making it.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks.